In this discussion, we will focus on the topic of dangerous medical devices, a topic that is not only of growing concern within the medical and scientific communities, but also, and perhaps more importantly, within the lay public and the popular press as well. Let's begin by looking at a cover story article from Consumer Reports magazine, May of 2012, called Dangerous Medical Devices. There was actually a news story on ABC News featuring this particular article, and I will provide the link for that news story separately. I would encourage you to stop this video and watch that news clip now before continuing. In this article, as you will see, they discuss a number of examples of medical devices that are very commonly used, but their efficacy and safety has been called into question. For example, surgical meshes, hip implants, and even some of the cardiovascular medical devices. The question is this really a new concern? Well, as a matter of fact, Forbes published a very similar article 6 years before, and this is the cover story article from Forbes magazine on essentially the same title even, Dangerous Medical Devices. 20 million Americans are walking around with high-tech medical gear grinding away inside them. The question is, are they safe? They use in this article from Forbes the metaphor ticking time bombs when they refer to pacing leads, for example. Here is one of the many interesting factoids from this article. 79 medical devices have been yanked off the market in the past 5 years because of potentially deadly side effects. As a result, FDA has been talking and talking and talking and talking about making fundamental changes in the way that it tracks medical devices, something akin to, on the drug side of the world, what we call post-market surveillance or phase 4. It's interesting to compare post-market surveillance for drugs and for medical devices. On the drug side, while we do have a well-established and some would argue robust regulatory framework for post-market surveillance, the simple reality is it simply does not happen very often, which unfortunately begs the question, what good is having regulation if it's not realistic? That's really the subject of a different conversation. Moving back to the medical device side of the world, I find it interesting in 2012 that we're still debating on what the framework should be, the regulatory framework should be for a medical device post-market surveillance or tracking system. As I often say, there is no better way to ensure that we never find a problem than not to look for one. And once again, this is the topic of a post-market surveillance discussion, but is there really any incentive for a manufacturer to continue to study a product after it's on the market? In short, not only is there no incentive to do so, we've actually created some strong disincentives to do so, because in addition to the time, cost, and money that the post-market study will take, what is the risk of finding a problem that we didn't know about before, and now potentially we have to take off the market a product that we were previously selling? So this is a very interesting and very complex issue, an issue that is by no means not unique to the medical world, medical device world. We have exactly the same issue in terms of drugs and biologics as well. Within this cover story article from Forbes, November 27, 2006, once again, they describe a number of interesting medical device examples. For example, hip implants, pacing leads and implantable cardiac defibrillators, stents, vagus nerve stimulators, and so on, and so on, and so on. These issues are not, in fact, new, and they've been going on for quite some time. Here is one of my favorite quotes from Dan Schultz, who is the former top medical device regulator at FDA, who said that new medical devices don't need the large-scale exhaustive clinical trials of the drug industry because it's easier to predict the behavior of a machine than it is to track the chemical interactions of a new drug in the body. What Dr. Schultz is describing here is the governing philosophy, as I like to call it, of CDRH, called least burdensome. Least burdensome to whom? That is an interesting question, and I'll leave that as a rhetorical one. But nonetheless, many in this industry, as well as in the FDA, make a very fundamental assumption that medical devices do not achieve their intended use, their intended benefit, via any kind of biochemical or pharmacological means, and therefore they don't need to be tested to the extent that a drug would, for example. Well, suffice it to say, I have a PhD in biomedical engineering. I would never be so arrogant as to claim that I can predict how a medical device is going to interact within the body. Because even if you want to take a fairly straightforward medical device example, like a bare metal stent, I'm not even talking about a drug-eluting stent here, I'm talking about simply a bare metal stent. Well, one can certainly argue that the primary mode of action of the bare metal stent is mechanical, and that is that it's mechanically propping open the artery to allow the blood to continue to flow. Clearly, at some point, our medical device has to go inside of the body and as a result interact with all of that biology, all of that biochemistry and pharmacology. So, long story short, and this is a very complex issue, but for us to continue to make this assumption that physics is easier to understand than biology, or that mechanics is easier to understand than biochemistry, will not only explain why we have had so many problems with medical devices in the past, but unfortunately, we can predict that we will continue to have many in the future. Why is this? As I just described, because the conventional logic that many in this industry follow or subscribe to is that mechanics is easier to understand than biology. But is it really so simple? After all, as I often say, whenever we start to think we understand something, especially when it comes to biology or medicine, that's when I get nervous. But really, is this a new concern? Here's an interesting quote. There is nothing new under the sun, but there are lots of old things we don't know. In this particular case, I would modify this slightly. There's nothing new under the sun, but there are a lot of old things that perhaps we haven't thought about or perhaps we have forgotten. So how does this apply here? Well, looking back historically, here's an article from Popular Mechanics entitled Danger in the Hospital. In the growing field of medical devices, there are no standards of safety or performance. Until they are established, hospitals will have no guarantee that equipment will operate properly or even that it won't kill you. Perhaps the most interesting thing to note about this particular article is the date. It was published in February 1971. To put things in historical perspective, when did the Safe Medical Devices Act kick in? The original Safe Medical Devices Act, not the amendments that came later. The original Safe Medical Devices Act kicked in 1976. So this article, published in Popular Mechanics, predated the Safe Medical Devices Act by 5 years. These issues are not new. The difference today is that we have a growing amount of number of people looking at them, especially from the popular press. And while, as they say, sunshine is the best disinfectant, the question is, where were all of these folks decades ago, even back in 1976 or prior to that, when it came to these same issues? To wrap this up, here's one of my many favorite quotes from Alvin Toffler, the futurist and best-selling author, who said that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but rather those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. The challenge for all of us is to recognize that what we have learned in the past, either through school or perhaps even through experience, may not be the entire truth. And we have to be constantly questioning what we know and what we think. I spend a pretty fair amount of my time in industry and in the regulatory agencies like FDA trying to get people not to simply teach people, but as Alvin Toffler said, to get people to unlearn some of the things that they have learned in the past that are not in fact the case, or perhaps not the entire case, and get them to rather consider new ways of thinking and expand their horizons. This, as you can imagine, is not an easy thing to do. In fact, many people are very resistant to this, but nonetheless, it's an important thing to do. For those who forget their history, or for those who do not acknowledge their history, they're doomed to repeat it. And unfortunately, within the world of medicine in general, and within the world of regulatory affairs in particular, we seem to do this over and over again. Certainly something to think about.